All right, guys, today is going to be chapter 15, the vascular system. So we're going to talk about veins, arteries, capillaries, blood pressure, blood vessels, all of those things. So it'll be a little bit of a continuation of last week's stuff. But on average, the vascular system is approximately 60,000 miles long, enough to circle the Earth twice. So that's a pretty big deal, which is why we really need to spend some time learning about this. Every piece of our body really relies on our vascular system, and there's great demands on the system because it must get to every part of the body, and it must adapt to changes in every part of the body. So that's why it's so important. So there is 3 different types of blood vessels. We have arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries in diagrams like this are almost always represented in red. They carry blood away from the heart, okay? Veins are almost always represented in blue, okay? They return blood to the heart. And then capillaries are these small little vessels, okay, that connect the smallest arteries to the smallest veins. And that's really where oxygen and nutrient diffusion happens, okay? So we get oxygen going to the tissues, and then the blood picks up the waste products like carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. And so the blood vessels have multiple artery or layers, and this is true of both arteries and veins. So we have the tunic intima, so that's the innermost layer, consists of simple squamous epithelium. It has this nice smooth surface that keeps blood flowing freely. So we want it to be nice and smooth so that we don't get plaque formation or buildup of any type on this layer, because that would obstruct blood flow. The tunic media is the middle layer, composed of smooth muscle and elastic tissue. It really is what allows the blood vessels to change diameter. So these blood vessels can dilate or get bigger, or they can constrict and get smaller. The smooth muscle in this layer is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Then we have the tunic externa, so the outermost layer, strong, flexible, fibrous connective tissue, and this really is to support and protect the blood vessel. So we do have different categories of arteries. We have conducting arteries, distributing arteries, and arterioles. Arteries must be really strong, okay? Because when the heart pumps and pushes that blood out into the aorta, which is like the first main artery, there's a lot of pressure in those vessels. So that's why they have to be so strong. It's from the pumping action of the heart, forcing that blood at a higher pressure into their vessels. What I really want you to know here is the arterioles. So the arteries closest to the heart are the largest. They branch and divide, growing smaller as they travel away from the heart. The conducting arteries expand as blood surges into them and recoil when ventricles relax. So they can expand and relax. This includes some of the largest arteries, including the aorta. The distributing arteries carry blood to specific organs, so they kind of branch off of the aorta or the larger vessels, things like the brachial or femoral or the renal arteries. Hopefully you already have heard of the brachial and the radial, right? Because those are involved in taking heart rate and blood pressure. And then the arterioles are the smallest arteries, and through contraction of smooth muscle in their walls, right, the tunic media we just talked about, they can resist the flow of blood to help regulate blood pressure and control blood flow to an organ. There's really too many arterioles to name, but really what their job is to do is to connect capillaries. Veins really converge, forming progressively larger and fewer vessels as they lead back to the heart. So they kind of start out small and then get larger as they get closer to the heart. They have thinner walls and arteries. They have a great ability to stretch and can constrict extensively. The veins' primary job is to return blood to the heart. The walls of the veins are thinner because they're not subjected to as high of pressures. Once that blood flow gets farther and farther away from the heart through the arterial system, the pressure actually drops. So they don't have to be as strong, but they still must stretch to allow blood flow to return. 3 different categories of veins, just kind of like the arteries. We have venules, They're the smallest veins, so they're very similar to arterioles. They collect blood from the capillaries. They have thin porous walls, and they can help to exchange fluid from surrounding tissues. They then go into medium-sized veins, okay? They're a little bit thicker, more elastic, and they contain one-way valves to prevent backflow. So we have to work against gravity a little bit to return blood flow to the heart. So the medium and large-sized veins have these valves to help push the blood flow back. And then the large veins are results of the convergence of medium-sized veins. They have a really thick tunic externa, and some examples, one of the biggest examples is the inferior and superior vena cava, which we learned about last week. So let's talk more in detail about capillaries. They're really the exchange vessels. They're microscopic vessels that link arterioles and venules, okay? This is where nutrients, waste, and hormones are transferred between blood and tissues. The capillary wall consists only of endothelium and a basement membrane, so it really allows particles to pass through very easily. You can see this diagram here is showing you that. Very, very small membrane, which allows the particles to move from the inside to the exterior to get out to the tissues and surrounding areas. This is what a capillary bed really looks like, kind of called capillary organization. We have these capillary beds located throughout the body. You don't need to know, each step on how this works, but you need to know that it exists. So what happens is we have these little sphincters on the beginning part of the capillary bed that can open or close this capillary bed. So when we need to get more oxygenated blood to certain parts of our body, like say when we're exercising, these little sphincters will open and allow blood flow to get to these capillary beds. Say we're running from that scared bear, our sympathetic nervous system is kicked in. We don't need to get as much oxygenated blood flow to maybe our digestive system, okay? We are going to clamp that off and not get as much blood flow there. Or in this circumstance, rest, this would be like the muscular tissue, okay? We are just kind of resting, relaxing. We're not getting as much oxygenated blood flow to the muscles because they're not using that oxygen. So here you can see how, a two-way exchange really happens between the capillaries. That's that really small membrane. So things like oxygen, glucose, hormones, and nutrients can go in and out of that capillary to surrounding tissue. Usually those things are moving out, and things like waste products, carbon dioxide, ammonia, those things are going in to be returned to the heart and to be gotten rid of, and water can go back and forth. So there's three mechanisms of action that make this capillary exchange happen: diffusion, filtration, and osmosis, which are not new terms to us. We did learn about those back at the beginning of A&P, but we will do a little refresher here. So diffusion is the most important mechanism of capillary exchange. Substances move from an area of greater to lesser concentration. So this is based on a concentration gradient, okay? So here, the blood flow that's coming into the capillary bed, this is the arterial end of the capillary bed, has high amounts of oxygen in it. The tissues have low oxygen. So naturally, oxygen is going to diffuse across this membrane into the tissues. Whereas the tissues have high amounts of CO2, blood has low amounts of CO2. That's going to diffuse naturally across this on the venous side of the capillary bed, and that blood is going to go into the venous system and be returned to the heart. Filtration occurs closest to the arterial side, okay, over here of the capillary bed, and it's related to pressure, okay? So the pressure on the arterial side is about 30 to 35 milligrams of mercury. The pressure in the surrounding tissue is about 2. So high amounts of pressure in here, low amounts of pressure in here. So naturally that pressure is going to force things like glucose, amino acids, plasma across that capillary membrane into the tissue fluid. Thankfully, the tissues and the tissue fluid needs those. Colloid osmotic pressure is slightly different, okay? What happens here is as blood continues to move towards the venous end of the capillary, blood pressure inside the capillary drops. So we get like the opposite thing happening. You have proteins in the blood exert this colloid osmotic pressure, in which albumin pulls tissue fluid along with the cell's waste products into the capillary. So it's related to albumin, and it actually helps to get the waste products out of the cells here, or the tissue surrounding the capillary bed, and return it into the blood so that it can be pumped back to the heart. So let's watch our first animation here.
The body uses several different mechanisms to move substances into and out of capillaries. These mechanisms are diffusion, filtration, and osmosis. The most important mechanism for capillary exchange is diffusion. In diffusion, substances move from areas of greater to lesser concentration. The process begins as blood flows into a capillary from the arterial system. Arterial blood is rich in oxygen. Therefore, the concentration of oxygen inside the capillary increases to a level greater than the level of oxygen in the surrounding tissue fluid. As a result, oxygen diffuses out of the capillary and into the surrounding fluid. At the same time, carbon dioxide, which is more concentrated in the fluid of the surrounding tissue, diffuses into the capillary. Filtration is another method of capillary exchange. Filtration occurs close to the arterial side of the capillary bed. In this process, blood entering the capillary from the arterial system creates a pressure of about 30 to 35 millimeters of mercury inside the capillary. Meanwhile, pressure in the surrounding tissue fluid is about 2 millimeters of mercury. The higher pressure in the capillary pushes plasma and dissolved nutrients, such as glucose and amino acids, through the capillary wall and into the surrounding fluid. This is filtration. Meanwhile, as the blood continues to move toward the venous end of the capillary, blood pressure inside the capillary drops. The lower pressure allows proteins in the blood, such as albumin, to exert what is known as colloid osmotic pressure. In this mechanism, the albumin in the blood pulls tissue fluid, together with the cell's waste products, into the capillary.
So just a refresher of what I just was mentioning to you. The other thing we need to talk about is pulmonary circulation. So really there's two major pathways of circulation in the body: pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. Okay, so pulmonary circulation routes blood to and from the lungs to exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen, right? The veins bring the blood, the deoxygenated blood that's high in carbon dioxide, back to the right side of the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. Circulates through the lungs here, okay, leaves that right ventricle, okay, branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries, enters the lungs, okay, and the pulmonary artery branches into lobular arteries, one for each lobe of the lung. These arteries continue to branch into smaller and smaller arteries until they end at a capillary bed. So just like out in the tissues, there's a capillary bed in the pulmonary circulation inside the lungs. And this is where exchange, again, of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens. So carbon dioxide and waste products are expelled, basically, okay, into our lungs to be exhaled, and oxygen is picked up into the blood so that the blood becomes oxygenated and is pushed back to the left side of the heart to be pumped out to the body. Come on.
Pulmonary circulation routes blood to and from the lungs to exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen. It does not supply the lung tissue itself with oxygen. Those needs are met through systemic circulation. Pulmonary circulation begins as blood leaves the right ventricle through the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which enter the lungs. The pulmonary artery branches into lobar arteries, one for each lobe of the lung. These arteries branch into smaller and smaller arteries until ending at the capillary beds. The capillaries surround the alveoli, where the exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide occurs. The capillaries form venules, which merge to form veins. The veins merge and finally form the pulmonary veins. 2 pulmonary veins from each lung return oxygenated blood to the left atrium.
So in the next chapter, we'll learn more about what really happens in the alveoli in the lungs. But for now, you need to know these steps. So the other part is systemic circulation. So this is what brings that oxygenated blood and nutrients to the organs and picks up the waste products. So all systemic arteries arise directly or indirectly from the aorta. So we know the aorta comes right off of the left ventricle. And it's divided into 3 regions. We have the ascending aorta, which rises a few centimeters above the left ventricle. The right and left coronary arteries branch off the ascending aorta to supply blood to the myocardium, which we learned last section. Then becomes the aortic arch, which curves over the heart and turns downward behind the heart, making an inverted kind of U shape. The aortic arch branches into 3 major arteries: brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. Then it becomes the descending aorta, which travels downward past the heart through the thoracic and abdominal cavities. It's called the thoracic aorta above the diaphragm and the abdominal aorta below the diaphragm. Okay, then goes down farther to branch into the right and left common iliac arteries, which supplies the lower half of the body with blood. So pulses. So arteries are what cause pulses. So hopefully that's not a new thing for you. You've already been finding pulses on each other, taking blood pressures. So which one of these do we use to take a blood pressure? So we should be using the brachial artery to take a blood pressure, a radial artery to take a pulse, but you could feel a pulse in any one of these areas. We tend not to feel a pulse in the carotid artery because you can stimulate some other things that we don't want to happen by massaging the carotid artery. So here's the principal arteries in the body. The ones that I want you to know are the thoracic aorta, which I already just was telling you about, and the common iliac artery, which is what divides and supplies the lower bodies. Then we have the femoral artery, which supplies each of the legs. Okay, you can usually feel that pretty good in the groin area. Then we have the brachial artery and the radial artery. So those are the ones that I want you to know. Arteries of the head and neck. So we just need to know that there's right and left carotid arteries, which supplies most of the brain with a constant supply of oxygen. There is an internal and external carotid on each side. Circle of Willis, I want you to be familiar with because you're going to talk about it when you talk about conditions that affect the brain. But this is basically how the different lobes of the brain get oxygen. And basically, on the undersurface of the brainstem, the 2 vertebral arteries unite to form a single basilar artery. That branches from the internal carotids, and the basal artery forms several anastomoses, which are connections, to create a circle of arteries at the base of the brain called the circle of Willis. So you don't have to know all these things that it's made up of, but you need to know that there's this circular structure called the circle of Willis, which then divides into multiple things to supply all the different lobes of the brain. Okay, so you just need to know that the circle of Willis is there. There's lots of different connections on it, and that's often where things go wrong. So our principal veins, what I want you to know, which you already do know, are the superior and inferior vena cava here, okay? The hepatic vein is there, okay? We have internal and external jugular, and then basically we just have lots of veins throughout the body, but don't need to know a ton of different ones there. This is just showing the internal and external jugular vein and vertebral vein. So just like we have arteries, we have veins then that bring the blood from those areas back to the heart. One thing I do want to show you here is hepatic portal circulation. So basically the liver's job is to clean the blood of toxins, okay? You don't need to know all the different steps of this, but you need to know this in a general sense of what happens here. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you the animation.
Veins from the digestive organs and spleen send their blood through the hepatic portal vein to the liver. This circulatory pathway allows the liver to modify the blood returning to the heart, such as by removing excess glucose or toxins, such as bacteria or alcohol. Specifically, blood from the capillaries of the spleen, stomach, pancreas, gallbladder, and intestines flows into the superior mesenteric vein and the splenic vein. These veins converge to form the portal vein. Blood from the left and right gastric veins empties into the hepatic portal vein. The portal vein channels the blood into the liver. The blood is then distributed to innumerable microscopic sinusoids, which are the capillaries of the liver. The blood flows out of the sinusoids into the hepatic vein. From there, the blood flows into the inferior vena cava, where it is returned to the heart.
So the main job here really is to filter the blood of waste products. And they talk specifically about things like medications, alcohol, which is why people who drink a lot of alcohol have liver disease. But again, like I said, you don't need to know all the different steps of that. You just need to know what it does. The last piece that I really want to talk about here is blood pressure. So hopefully this isn't a new concept since you've been taking blood pressures, but we need to kind of understand a little bit more detail how we measure blood pressure, but how pressure really changes and is in the circulation. So first, blood flows because of differences in pressures between two structures. So it goes on a pressure gradient. That's what causes it to move away from the heart, okay, where pressure is really high. As it moves away from the heart, and that's what this is kind of showing you here, as pressure moves away from the heart, all right, that pressure declines. And the greater the difference in pressure between 2 points, the greater the flow. Okay, so systolic blood pressure is when the heart is contracting, diastolic is when it's relaxing. So this is what's happening kind of as blood is coming out of the heart into the arteries. As it goes into the capillary bed, it continues to decrease. And in the venous system, the pressure is very, very decreased, especially as it gets closer back to the heart. So that's really what causes blood flow to move. So what kind of factors are going to affect blood pressure? Cardiac output, which we talked about. Increased cardiac output, so increased amount of blood coming out of the heart equals increased blood pressure. Okay, decreased cardiac output equals decreased blood pressure. Okay, blood volume, so when blood volume declines, such as from dehydration or blood loss, blood pressure falls, right? Less pressure in the hose, right? Or less volume in the hose equals less pressure in the hose. Okay, so when that happens, we have lots of different mechanisms that help to increase blood pressure, but we'll learn all about those things. We've learned about some of them, but we'll continue to learn about more of them as we continue through A&P. And then resistance. So we have increased resistance equals decreased flow and increased pressure. So that means if a vein or an artery is constricting and getting smaller and smaller, we have more and more resistance. We're going to have higher and higher pressure. And so the opposite will happen if we have decreased resistance. We're going to have decreased pressure. So let's talk a little bit more about resistance. Resistance occurs as the friction of blood against the walls of the vessel. So the amount of friction really depends on two different things: blood viscosity, or the thickness of the blood. Okay, increased thickness, it's going to flow slower. Decreased thickness, it's going to flow faster. And then vessel diameter. Okay, so the bigger the vessel is or the smaller the vessel is, that's going to affect how fast blood can flow. So vasoconstriction here is the term for reduction in the diameter of a vessel. So as that vessel gets smaller and smaller, we're going to have increased pressure because that same amount of blood is trying to now flow through a hose that's significantly smaller in diameter. Versus vasodilation is an increase in the diameter of the blood vessel. And that's going to cause us to have decreased pressure. So this is what our body's going to do if we want to increase or decrease blood pressure. Our body has the ability to control the vessels. So if our blood pressure is too high, we can dilate our vessels around our body to decrease the amount of blood flow. So to continue our discussion here, the next thing we're going to talk about is blood velocity. So really, that's kind of how fast the blood flows. So if you look at this chart here, it shows you that certainly the blood is flowing the fastest as it comes out of the aorta, which makes sense. That's a really, really large vessel, right? So we have a bigger vessel, bigger diameter. We're going to have increased flow through that blood vessel. As the blood vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller, that velocity is certainly going to go down because the diameter of those vessels is small. And as the blood returns to the heart, we're going to get kind of some increased flow again because those vessels are going to get larger. So we have a couple ways that we regulate blood pressure. Neural regulation of blood pressure through the nervous system and hormonal regulation of blood pressure. So in neural regulation of blood pressure, this is controlled by our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system, okay? The vascular system can quickly adjust to blood pressure and alter the flow of blood to respond to the body's changing needs. And this occurs because of the nervous system and sympathetic and parasympathetic hormones, okay? So we get baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and aortic arch, which detect changes in blood pressure. So this is what sends the stimuli, okay, to the cardiac control center and the vasomotor center in the medulla. If the pressure is too high, the medulla increases its output of parasympathetic impulses, right? Our rest and digest system. This causes vasodilation, so those vessels dilate, heart rate and stroke volume decrease, and blood pressure drops. The opposite occurs if the blood pressure is too low, the medulla increases output of sympathetic impulses, okay? So that fight or flight system. Vasoconstriction occurs, heart rate, stroke volume, and blood pressure rise.
The vascular system can quickly adjust blood pressure and alter blood flow to respond to the body's changing needs. One way it does this is through input from the nervous system. Specifically, an area of the medulla in the brain, called the vasomotor center, will, when stimulated, send impulses via the autonomic nervous system to alter blood vessel diameter and therefore blood pressure. Baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and aortic arch also detect and respond to changes in blood pressure. Baroreceptors transmit signals along the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the cardiac control center and the vasomotor center in the medulla. If the baroreceptors detect that the pressure is too high, the medulla will increase its output of parasympathetic impulses. Parasympathetic impulses cause vasodilation. Then the heart rate and the stroke volume also decrease, and blood pressure drops. If the pressure is too low, the medulla will increase its output of sympathetic impulses. Sympathetic stimulation results in vasoconstriction. The heart rate and the stroke volume also increase, and blood pressure rises.
So just a review of what I just talked about there. So the opposite side of this, or not the opposite, but the other side of this is hormonal regulation of blood pressure. So there's a number of different hormones that raise blood pressure. Some we've already talked about, some we're going to talk more about when we get to the urinary system. But here I would just want you to know about them in general, okay? So we have the renin-angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2 kind of system, all right, causes vasoconstriction and water retention, which increases blood pressure. These are all spelled out in your book for you as well. We have aldosterone, okay, which we just learned about in our endocrine chapter. Also stimulates the kidneys to retain sodium. Water follows sodium, increases blood volume, increases blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone we just talked about as well. Promotes vasoconstriction and water retention, thereby increasing blood pressure. Then we have epinephrine and norepinephrine. Again, we just learned about these. They cause vasoconstriction, so they increase, again, blood pressure. The one that doesn't really is ANP. That's the kind of opposing one that causes blood pressure to fall. So you need to know the ones that cause the blood pressure to increase and the one that causes the blood pressure to decrease. And you should know some more details about certainly aldosterone, ADH, epi, and norepi because we just learned about those in the last chapter, or a couple sections ago, sorry, in the endocrine chapter. So 2 mechanisms that help with venous return actually are skeletal muscles and the respiratory pump. So most of the veins must fight the forces of gravity to deliver blood back to the heart. There's 2 key mechanisms that do this. Here we're going to see one of them, these skeletal muscles. So this is called the skeletal muscle pump, okay? When the muscles contract, they massage the veins, propelling blood toward the heart. Okay, the valves in the vein ensure that the blood flows upward towards the heart, so it can't flow backwards because of the vein or the valves over here you can see. When the muscles relax, the blood flows backwards, pulled by the force of gravity, kind of puddles in the valve flaps, keeping the valves closed, preventing further backflow. So this is the skeletal muscle pump, and here's the respiratory pump. So the skeletal muscle pump really helps in our extremities. The respiratory pump is going to help more in our thoracic cavity. So during inhalation, the chest expands and the diaphragm moves downward. This causes pressure in the chest cavity to drop and the pressure in the abdominal cavity to rise. The rising abdominal pressure squeezes the inferior vena cava, forcing the blood upwards towards the thorax. The lower pressure in the thorax then helps the blood flow into the thoracic cavity because, again, blood wants to move on across this pressure gradient. Okay, so the pressure is going to increase in the abdominal cavity, forcing it into the thoracic cavity where there's lower pressure, just assisting in it returning back to the heart.